Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video on History Valley podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Jodi Magness, and today we're going to be discussing her new book called Jerusalem Through the Ages, From Its Beginnings to the Crusades. So it's good to have you back on History Valley podcast, Professor Magness.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, thank you. So I'd like to take us right to the beginning. When was Jerusalem first established?
Yeah, so the earliest archaeological remains that we have in Jerusalem date back about 5,000 years. So to the beginning of a period that archaeologists call the Bronze Age, specifically the early Bronze Age, when we have some remains of pottery found inside tombs, some partial remains of houses. So that's really the first evidence that we have of permanent settlement in Jerusalem.
And what was the population size then? Was it small or was it already
Oh,
substantial?
yeah. No, it was tiny. It would have been tiny, and it would have been tiny for centuries afterwards. So, I don't know how I mean, we don't have enough remains in that very early period to be able to know or determine what the size of the settlement was, but from slightly later periods in the Bronze Age, we do. And, it wouldn't have been more than, several hundred at the most, probably.
And when did it start becoming more like a sophisticated city? When did that start happening?
Yeah, that depends on which archaeologist you ask, because archaeologists disagree about the size and extent of the city in various periods, especially in those very early periods. Part of the problem is due to later overbuilding, to the reuse of buildings once they're constructed over many periods, to disagreements among archaeologists about the dating of specific pottery types, which are used to date the remains. So that would really depend, but it looks like for really a long time till we get at least up to the time of David and Solomon, and maybe even a little bit afterwards, that the city was pretty small and confined um, pretty much entirely to a little hill just to the south of where the Temple Mount is located, called the City of David, or sometimes it's called the Eastern Hill, or the Southeastern Hill, or the Lower City. But again, even among archaeologists, there are disagreements about how much of that hill was settled in those early periods. So the hill itself is very small; it's only about 11 acres in size, but it's not clear that that even the entire hill was settled. So, in other words, it was a pretty small settlement, and this is connected to debates among archaeologists and biblical scholars alike about how accurate the biblical descriptions are of the kingdom of David and Solomon. If you visualize Jerusalem as being the capital of that kingdom, then what kind of capital city was this if it was so small, right? So the evidence that we have from archaeology in this case feeds into debates about the understanding of the biblical text.
And where did the name Jerusalem come from?
Yeah, it's funny because in Hebrew the name is Yerushalayim, and a lot of people today think that that's connected with the word shalom, which means peace. So city of peace, which is actually how it later came to be understood. But originally, it has nothing to do with that. The original name is not Hebrew at all. Actually, it's a sort of an earlier name that means foundation of the god Shalem. So we're talking about a name that originated before the arrival of the Israelites, and that referred to apparently the chief deity of the city. So most ancient cities in antiquity had a particular protector deity, and sometimes they were named in honor of that deity. Athens, named after the goddess Athena. And so in this case, apparently the city was named after Shalem, who is thought to have been possibly the god of the setting sun, maybe worshipped on that rocky outcrop that later comes to be the site of the Temple Mount. And this again was quite common. I mean, Jericho, Hebrew Jericho, was named in honor of the god of the moon, and Beit Shemesh, the which literally means the house of the sun god, a very famous biblical site. So this was a common practice in antiquity.
What was religious practice like when Jerusalem was first established?
Yeah, and not just when Jerusalem was first established, but for many centuries afterwards. in antiquity, ancient peoples, including the Israelites and later the Jews, interacted with their gods very differently from the way that we do today. So today, people tend to think, I think, if Westerners at least, if you believe in God, think that God is omnipresent. He's around us all the time. If you want, you can pray and interact with him anywhere. But that's not what ancient people believed. Ancient people thought that the gods and goddesses dwelled elsewhere, either up in heaven or maybe like the Greek Olympian gods on Mount Olympus or underground. And if you wanted to interact with the gods, if you wanted to have them come and be among you so they could protect you or do good things for you, you had to entice them to come to you. And the God of Israel was a kind of a God that's called a celestial deity, the kind of God who dwells up in heaven. And there were other ancient gods who also were considered celestial. So if you wanted to entice that kind of a God to come to you, what you would typically do is find a high spot on a mountain close to where the gods are up in heaven and build an altar up there and offer something good to entice the God to come down. And typically that would be the most precious food item that you could get at that time, which was a nice piece of meat. So you would slaughter an animal and then take chunks of the meat and burn them on the altar, and the smoke rising up to heaven would entice the God to come down to you. And then what you would typically do is, in order to ensure that the God stayed with you, build the God a house next to the altar where the God could dwell and be fed and clothed and bathed. And that house was a temple. And this is exactly how the temple in Jerusalem operated. In fact, the Hebrew word for temple is bait, which means house. And the Temple Mount, Har Abayit, literally means the mountain of the house. So it's literally conceived of as the house in which God dwelled. But unlike today, when we tend to think of the house of God as a congregational hall of prayer and worship, like a church, a synagogue, or a mosque that people gather inside, in antiquity, ordinary people didn't go into the house of God because they weren't allowed into the direct presence of God. They waited outside, congregated around the altar where the sacrifices were offered, and typically only priests were allowed to go into the temple, and they're the ones then who took care of the needs of the God. And that's the way that the Jerusalem temple also operated.
To go back to what you were saying earlier about comparing what the Hebrew Bible says to about Jerusalem compared to what we actually know about Jerusalem during the period of David and Solomon, um, how accurate is the Bible when it comes to that? Is it
Oh,
very inaccurate, kind of halfway accurate, or what?
that's the world's biggest question, Jacob. So look, it that's a question that you can't answer in one sentence. But I mean, first of all, what you have to do is define what you mean by the Bible, because the Bible is different things for different people, right? There's a Hebrew Bible, which for Jews is what Christians would call only the Old Testament, right? The books of the Old Testament, not the New Testament. Then you have a Protestant Bible and you have a Catholic Bible. And although those include the New Testament, they also include different books from each other and in different orders. There are other Bibles, right? Orthodox Christians have their own versions of the Bible. So first of all, you have to define what you mean by the Bible. Let's focus here on what Christians would consider the Old Testament, that is the books of the Hebrew Bible. And even within that, it's very complex because the books that are included in the order are not always the same among different groups or denominations. But with any Bible, no matter whose Bible you're using, if you open one up, the very first 5 books are the 5 books of Moses, right, which are the oldest books. And then after that, you have other books, the books of the prophets, and you have Psalms, and historical books like First and Second Samuel, and so on and so forth. So all of these are works that were composed by different people, all men. I always tell my students, sorry, but it was always men. They were composed by groups of people over the course of long periods of time, many centuries. And then once they were composed and written down, they were edited and re-edited until they reached us in the form that we have them. And so you can't just say, well, how accurate is the Bible? You would have to actually refer to which book you mean, right? Because some of the earlier books would be, let's say, probably less historically reliable than some of the later books, because the earlier books are written and transmitted orally, or contain information that was transmitted orally for a long period of time before it was written down. But even in the case of the later books, not necessarily always accurate. So how accurate or how historically reliable any given book of the Hebrew Bible is would depend on which book you're talking about, and more, no less important, which scholar you're asking, because pretty much all scholars have different opinions about the dates of those books, when they were edited or re-edited, which pieces of information in those books are historically reliable. So it's a complex question, and again, it depends on which of the books you're talking about.
How did Jerusalem fare under the Assyrian captivity?
Yeah, so I think you mean the Assyrians and not the Babylonians, right?
Correct.
You're okay. So just wanted to make sure. So just so your listeners may or may not be familiar with this, so a little bit of background on this. David and Solomon, and here I'm just going to sort of go according to the way the Hebrew Bible presents it, right? And not get into how historical this is. But David and Solomon ruled over a united kingdom of the 12 tribes of Israel, which is called the United Kingdom or the United Monarchy. When Solomon died, and it was Solomon, of course, who built the first temple on the Temple Mount, the first temple dedicated to the God of Israel on the Temple Mount. When Solomon died, the United Kingdom split into two halves, northern half and southern half. And the northern half of the kingdom, which now had its own rulers, its own dynasty, becomes known as the Kingdom of Israel, and it had a capital city of its own, which eventually becomes the city of Samaria. And the southern kingdom becomes known as the Kingdom of Judah, and its capital is at Jerusalem. Now, all of the inhabitants of both kingdoms were Israelites and worshiped the God of Israel, but politically, they're two separate entities. Now, while all of that is happening, a big empire was growing out to the east, a major Near Eastern power, and that is the Assyrian Empire, which was based in the area of what is today sort of the northern part of Iraq. And over the course of the 9th and 8th centuries BC, the Assyrians began to expand their control further and further towards the Mediterranean. And finally, then in the 8th century, in the second half of the 8th century, the Assyrians invaded the northern kingdom of Israel. And this then culminates with the Assyrians conquering the northern kingdom of Israel in the year 722 BC. So that's the end of the northern kingdom. The inhabitants of the northern kingdom are sent into exile in Assyria. 20 years later, in 701 BC, the Assyrians invaded the kingdom of Judah. And the king of Judah at the time was named Hezekiah. And in preparation for the Assyrian invasion, Hezekiah fortified the city of Jerusalem. He built a new wall around some of the new suburbs of the city, and also installed a new water system to provide the city with water in times of siege. And that system is often called Hezekiah's Tunnel. And the story is that the Assyrians then come in to Judah. They ravage much of the countryside of Judah, including destroying the major stronghold at Lachish, which is in the countryside. And they besiege the city of Jerusalem, but for reasons that are not clear, don't take the city. They don't manage to. They withdraw before the city falls. So Jerusalem survives. The kingdom of Judah survives, but in a weakened form and paying tribute to the Assyrians. And then, Judah survives until 586 BC when the Babylonians conquer it. So we don't actually, so from the point of view of what happens in Jerusalem at that time, there are several things. So one thing is that we have, these constructions of Hezekiah in Jerusalem, which are really interesting, including this expanded city fortification wall. Another thing that happens, and this is maybe connected with the construction of that wall, is that the city expands in size. That's why the new fortification wall is built, to fortify parts of the city that were newly settled. And that may have been the result, at least in part, of refugees from the northern kingdom who had fled the northern kingdom and went south to Judah. And at least some of them settled in Jerusalem, apparently. And that's why we see the expansion of the city at this time. And then another thing that happens that's kind of interesting is that this point, when we get to this sort of time in the history of Jerusalem, we begin to see Jerusalem really not just expanding but flourishing, and this may be connected possibly with the sort of incorporation of Judah into this broader context of Assyrian domination. I mean, Judah was still independent, but Assyria was the dominant empire. Geopolitically, Jerusalem becomes part of that picture, and so we see not just an expansion of the city, but a lot of growth and prosperity. And this may be a result of kind of the connections with Assyria at that point.
And what happened to Jerusalem at the end of the First
Yeah.
Temple period?
Right. And so during the 7th century BC, so the following century, the Assyrian Empire begins to weaken, and eventually, by the time we get to the end of the 7th century, the Empire of Assyria had been replaced as the dominant power in the ancient Near East by the Babylonian Empire, which was based in the southern part of what is today Iraq. And the Babylonians then start to launch their own series of invasions into Judah and into Jerusalem. And that culminates in 586 BC with the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. And at that time, they destroy Solomon's temple, the first temple on the Temple Mount. And they take the inhabitants of Jerusalem, actually, technically, the elite inhabitants of Jerusalem, and send them into exile in Babylonia. And this begins a period in Jewish history that's called the Babylonian exile. And so that's one of the sort of major historical breaks in Jewish history and in the history of Jerusalem, right? This sort of beginning of the Babylonian exile.
What did Jerusalem look like after the Babylonian captivity? The Babylonian captivity was over.
Yeah. After the destruction in 586 BC, at some point not too long after that, the Babylonian Empire itself began to weaken, and eventually was replaced as the dominant power in the ancient Near East by the Persian Empire, Persia based in the area of what is today Iran. And so approximately 65 years after the Babylonian exile begins, and at this point, the Jews and these descendants of the original inhabitants of Judah are living under Persian rule at this point. The Persian king, whose name was Cyrus, issued an edict allowing those people from Jerusalem and Judah who'd been exiled to Babylonia to return to their homeland and to rebuild Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple on the Temple Mount. And so these exiles come back. The city is rebuilt and is refortified under the governorship of Nehemiah. The temple is rebuilt. There's a new temple, what we call the Second Temple on the Temple Mount. It's consecrated in the year 516 BC. And what's very interesting is that the city at this point now, as rebuilt, has contracted in size a lot. It's much smaller than it was on the eve of its destruction by the Babylonians. Remember that before 586 BC, the city had expanded, at least in part because of those refugees coming in, but probably also connected with the prosperity under Assyrian rule to some degree. Now the city is very small in size, again, confined only to this little hill to the south of the Temple Mount, the hill of the city of David, and the Temple Mount itself, where the temple is located. And the reason why it's so small in size is because a lot of those exiles chose not to return to Jerusalem and Judah. They chose to stay behind in Babylonia because they had, become established there. Babylonia was the, wealthy, big center of the day, the cultural center. They had comfortable lives and didn't want to start again from scratch. So a lot of those exiles remained in Babylonia and formed the core of a very large Jewish diaspora that flourished in Babylonia for centuries afterwards. So the small size of the city of Jerusalem after these exiles return reflects the fact that many of the exiles chose to remain and not come back and resettle the city. And the city actually remained small in size like that for centuries afterwards. It wasn't until, and I know you wanted to talk about this, it wasn't until the Hasmonean period, when we get to sort of the middle of the 2nd century BC, that the city begins to expand in size again. And the reason for that is because in the middle of the 2nd century BC, the Jews who had been living under Greek rule, under the rule of Alexander the Great and his Greek successors at that point, the Jews were able to establish independence from Greek rule, thanks to a revolt, the Maccabean revolt, that's commemorated by the modern Jewish holiday of Hanukkah, and establish an independent Jewish kingdom ruled by the leaders of the revolt and their successors, who are called the Hasmoneans. And at that point, Jerusalem now becomes important because it becomes the capital of that kingdom, the capital of the Hasmonean kingdom. So the center for a local elite, with all the government, agencies that you would have accompanying that. And so now we see the expansion of the city once again, in the way that it had expanded, let's say, before 586 BC.
Did Jerusalem experience any significant changes when the Hellenistic period began?
Yeah, so the Hellenistic period begins after the Persian Empire falls to Alexander the Great, and then the country is, and then you know, uh, Jerusalem becomes part of the area ruled by Alexander and his Greek successors. And so the short answer is actually no. There isn't a lot of significant, there aren't a lot of significant changes in, at least in the size of the city, and for the most part, the buildings in the city, under Greek rule, because for them, Jerusalem was not an important city. It wasn't a capital city of anything. It was, was just like a city. It didn't have any special significance to the Greeks. The one sort of distinction that I would make here, or qualification, is that one of Alexander's Greek successors built a major fortress in Jerusalem called the Acra fortress, which we read about in connection with the Maccabees, and the location of which had eluded scholars and archaeologists for decades. There were many different schools of thought on where this major fortress was located. Eventually, it was taken and razed to the ground by one of the Maccabees at some point, but we had never found the remains of it. And so, lo and behold, within, let's say, the last decade or so, remains of this fortress have been identified in excavations just to the south of the Temple Mount, in an area that's called the Givati parking lot, where excavations are ongoing. And that is one of the most important discoveries in the archaeology of Jerusalem in the last number of years.
Did the rise of the Hasmonean dynasty change Jerusalem?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the Hasmoneans, because Jerusalem now became the capital of the Hasmonean kingdom, which is a Jewish kingdom, we get the development of a substantial Jewish elite in the city, because you have the rulers and they're accompanied by the elite, and everything that goes along with that, right? All of that wealth, all of that power flowing into the city, also attracting people who are working for the administration, the construction of buildings that may or may not have been sponsored by the rulers or by elites. So yes, the short answer is yes. Under the Hasmoneans, Jerusalem changes in appearance, and we get the construction of new buildings in the city, and also the expansion of the city. So it grows in size.
And how did Jerusalem fare during the First Jewish-Roman War, and what became of it when it was over?
Yeah, so in the year 66 AD, a Jewish revolt broke out against the Romans that we call the First Jewish Revolt, which culminated in the year 70 AD. The revolt, over the course of those 4 years, there wasn't fighting in Jerusalem during all those 4 years. Much of the fighting took place in other parts of the country, beginning sort of in the north. The Romans began in the north and worked their way southwards. But it ends with a long siege of Jerusalem in the year 70 by the Romans. And um, our most detailed description of what happens during that siege is provided by the ancient Jewish historian Josephus, Flavius Josephus of the first century AD, who provides very graphic descriptions of the appalling conditions in the city during the course of the siege. Almost certainly parts of it are fabricated or exaggerated, but there's a famous scholar who said even if only a small part of what he described happened, it was still all very appalling. And that siege then ends when the Romans manage to take the city. They enter through the area of the Temple Mount, onto the Temple Mount in the month of August of the year 70. They destroy the temple. Not clear if it was deliberate or accidental, but either way, the temple is burned down. Fighting continued in other parts of the city for the next month or so until finally the entire city was subdued. It was pretty much destroyed. Most of the buildings were destroyed, burned down during the course of the fall of the city. And those people who survived or were not killed at the end were taken into captivity and sold as slaves. And in fact, Josephus describes there being a glut of slaves on the slave market due to the large numbers of people who were captured at the end of that siege. The tallest and best looking young men, Jewish men, were taken to Rome and paraded through the streets as part of the victory parade that the Romans held after the siege ended.
And what about the Bar Kokhba revolt? Was Jerusalem rebuilt and destroyed again, or was there no Jerusalem during the Bar Kokhba revolt?
Yeah, so about 60 to 65 years after the first revolt ended, a second Jewish revolt broke out against the Romans, which we call the Bar Kokhba revolt, named after the leader of the revolt, Bar Kokhba, which took place from 132 to, usually it's said 132 to 135, but it's probably more 132 to 136. But what's interesting is that this revolt was provoked. The outbreak of the revolt was provoked by the announcement by the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who was the emperor at the time, that he was going to rebuild the city as a pagan Roman city called Aelia Capitolina and dedicate a new temple on the Temple Mount, not to the God of Israel, but to the new patron deity of the city, Capitoline Jupiter. And that's what sparked the outbreak of that revolt. When the revolt ended, and it was a very costly revolt for the Jews and for the Romans, when the revolt ended, Hadrian did go along and rebuild the city as Aelia Capitolina and dedicated to this new patron deity. The big question is whether the Jews ever had control of Jerusalem during the period of the revolt. And there's no clear answer to that, but there's no definite evidence that the Jews actually ever controlled Jerusalem at any point during the course of the revolt. And so even if they did, by the time the revolt ends, the Romans are back in charge.
And when was Jerusalem repopulated by the Jews after the Bar Kokhba revolt?
Yeah, so Hadrian, because of the Bar Kokhba revolt, decided to punish the Jews in a number of ways. And one of the things that he did, in addition to rebuilding the city as this pagan Roman city called Aelia Capitolina, was to banish the Jews. He banned them from living in Jerusalem or its immediate environs. There's quite a bit of scholarly disagreement about how long that ban remained in place. And so there's a whole range of opinions about, well, that it lasted only 2 to 3 generations, or that it lasted for centuries afterwards. The fact is that we have no evidence of significant Jewish presence in Jerusalem for centuries. So it may be that small numbers of Jews visited Jerusalem, or maybe even lived in Jerusalem or its environs at some point, let's say after all of this. But Jerusalem pretty overwhelmingly was not a Jewish city and had very little, if any, Jewish population in it for a very long time after Hadrian rebuilds it as Aelia Capitolina. When we do begin to get definite Jewish presence in the city again is not until the 7th century AD. So we're talking again centuries afterwards, when the city was taken very early in the 7th century by the Sassanid Persians for a short period of time. And apparently Jews were allowed back into the city at that point. And then the city's retaken by the Byzantine Christians for a short period, and then it's taken by the Muslims. And when Jerusalem comes under the rule of the Muslims, Jews are allowed back into the city. And that's when we begin to get evidence of sustained, permanent Jewish presence again in Jerusalem.
So that takes me to the Crusader era. After you just pointed out, the Muslims took the city and they allowed the Jews in there. What happened that led up to the Crusader era over Jerusalem, over the who controls Jerusalem? Were Jews booted out of there by Muslims at a later point? What happened?
Yeah, no, Jews were actually never banned from Jerusalem during that period by Muslims. No, that's not. And in fact, Jerusalem under Muslim rule was a cosmopolitan city that included also large numbers of Christians. We have lots of information about that as well. So, Muslim rule was actually quite tolerant, and even though people who were not Muslims had to pay a special tax, nevertheless they had really quite a large degree of religious freedom, and so. So the city really had members of different kinds of religious communities in it. That actually changes with the Crusaders. So as you were not nearly as tolerant, by the way. So what's interesting, and this is something I talk about in the book, is that what sparked the Crusades, and I'm not saying that this is the actual underlying cause of the Crusades, because the Crusades have undoubtedly a very complex history behind them, but what provoked sort of the outbreak of the Crusades is an event that occurred in the year 1009 AD, when a Muslim caliph named Al-Hakim ordered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre systematically dismantled from top to bottom. So the entire church was sort of torn down, except for the rotunda, which is the circular dome structure that enshrines the site that's venerated as the tomb of Christ. But the rest of the church, meaning the basilica, the congregational hall of prayer and worship, that was dismantled, and it was that act that provoked the outbreak of the Crusades. The Crusader mantra was to retake the Holy Land from the infidels, right, and specifically to retake the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And so when the Crusaders come in and retake Jerusalem, which they did after a siege, and I talk about that in the book. What they did was to ethnically cleanse the city. So there's a horrible massacre of the inhabitants, the Jewish and Muslim inhabitants of the city, and subsequently the city then the population of the city is Christian, only Christian, albeit different kinds of Christians, right? There were Eastern Christians, Western Christians. So I mean, it was within the context of Christianity, it was diverse, but in terms of the population of the city, there were no Jews or Muslims living in the city at that point. It becomes a Christian city. So that's really, I mean, it's really one of the great breaks in the history of Jerusalem, is that event of a really violent ethnic cleansing of the population of Jerusalem. And that, by the way, I should mention, that's not something that happened with the Muslim conquest back in the 7th century. When the Muslims took Jerusalem in the 7th century, probably somewhere around the year 638, there's a debate about what year, Jerusalem actually surrendered peacefully to the Muslims. There were negotiated terms, and the city was not destroyed and not damaged, and the population just continued to reside there. Although now Jews under Muslim rule were allowed back to live in the city again.
And what became of Jerusalem after the Crusader era was over?
Yeah, so eventually the Crusader kingdom, of course, has a very long history, right, and a bit of a complex history. But eventually the Muslims retake the country. They retake the land of the Crusader kingdom, including the city of Jerusalem. And at that point, again, we get this kind of more diverse population, so Jews and Muslims in the city. In terms of the monuments, the Crusaders converted some of the Muslim monuments into Christian monuments. So the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, for example, and the Temple Mount, the Muslims reconvert those back into Muslim monuments. And some of the other monuments around the city also are converted into use by the Muslims. But interestingly, because there is a continuity at this point in the history of the city, many of the buildings that the Crusaders built around the city remain until today. They still survive until today and are part of the fabric of the old city of Jerusalem, even if their original function has changed over the course of time.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Jodi Magness.
Well, thank you for having me back, Jacob. I hope your listeners will buy the book and enjoy reading it.
And to that end, check out the Amazon History Valley affiliate link in the description box below and in the pinned comment to get her book.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.